Welcome to the Feast Presents video series. This is an introductory presentation to address some of the paganism that was introduced into the institutional church. And we're going to see how many of these pagan ideas began over 1,700 years ago. In fact, if you have not heard the gospel apart from the cross event, you have not heard the gospel. Now that might sound like a remarkable statement, but we will explain this as we go along. We are so far off the track in what the scriptures actually suggest. And it began because we allowed certain pagan ideas to be introduced into Christianity a long time ago. And we've been building on them ever since. So this has greatly affected the discussion that we have in church. Many times, even to the point where we're not allowed to have these discussions in church because we have to even sign documents, and we have doctrines of faith and statements of beliefs that we have to sign our names to, and to consider anything else may even cost a pastor his job or even be kicked out of the church. So this is a really big issue. We will also even venture into how this has greatly affected the discussion regarding the return of Christ. We're not allowed essentially to have a discussion in relation to the return of Christ in the context of when he will return. That is not permitted. So if the scriptures suggest that Jesus is coming back in 2027, well, that's not allowed, because we have these verses that we've understood in the wrong context, and we haven't even done our homework in understanding the words that are used in the scripture when we apply these. So when someone says that Jesus might return in 2027 based upon what the scripture suggests, somebody will say, no, that's not allowed because no one knows the day or the hour. So we're not predicting anything here. We're just suggesting what the scriptures suggest. So in terms of the day and the hour, there's actually two different Greek words used in the Matthew 24 text referring to this phrase that we like to use. I've yet to meet a pastor who even realized that simple fact. On top of that, the word know in the phrase, no one knows the day or the hour, is actually in the present indicative active form. Now this greatly affects the meaning of the text. And so we need to unwrap these things in the true context of what Jesus is trying to say. Matter of fact, the very fact that it's in the present indicative active form tells us that by implication of the rest of things that Jesus says in the passage, we should know exactly the fact that he's coming, and he's given us an approximate date, even in Matthew, as to his return. So we ought to know, and in fact, as you read further in Matthew 24, and even going through into chapter 25, we better know, or we risk being gnoskoed like those in the day of Noah. Gnosko is a Greek word that's also translated know in the text, and it means to learn something by experience. So in Noah's day, they didn't prepare even though they knew a flood was coming, but when it did come, they learned by experience. They gained knowledge by experience when the flood came and wiped them all out. And Jesus uses that exact terminology in Matthew 24 in describing his return to us. He says, if you don't prepare, you will be gnoskoed, or learn by experiencing what's coming, if you don't prepare. So these are serious issues. I mean, in the case of Christ coming, people's lives may be at stake. And so it is important for us to not only know the approximate time of Jesus' return, but also how to prepare for what comes leading up to his return. So in the process, you're going to hear things, and even already in terms of Christ coming, that just make us a little uncomfortable in relation to the things that we've already been taught. And so we have to be able to give ourselves permission to actually work through these things. We have to allow the scriptures to tell us what is really going on. We have a tendency to have an idea and impose it onto the scriptures and try to make the scriptures fit our preconceptions. And so much of this was caused by the pagan ideas that were brought into the church early on, and then over the last 17 centuries we've been building on those things going forward. So we want to address that. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to suggest is that we, in understanding the Scriptures, have lost the context of all contexts. We might get the context of a particular passage pretty good and pretty close, but we exchange the context of all contexts in which to understand the Scripture with another. And it was actually one that was introduced to us in the garden event way back some 10 decades of millennia ago. So here we are now, 30,000 different denominations or non-denominational groups, all in disagreement over what's going on in the Scripture. None of us have any real clue as to what the right way is. We have our own ideas of what it might be, but for every one of us that thinks one way, there's thousands that think a different way. And so we're left with a lot of confusion. And for me and many of us who have figured this out, the elephants are leaving the room. We no longer have these huge issues that remain in the church and have been there for some centuries now. So we need to go back and find the context that Jesus Christ reintroduces us to in terms of what's really going on. And it was the context that we lost sight of in the garden, and we were presented with a different context in which to understand our reality. And it's described even in the tree that Adam and Eve ate from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So much of our theology is actually rooted in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this is a tragedy because it's not a healthy way to live. Paul describes it in terms of the mind, the fallen mind, as being death. The carnal mind is death. So in the end, the church in many ways is promoting death, the death that Paul refers to as the carnal mind. It was reintroduced through Augustine many, many years ago, and it's been built on ever since. And some of you may even know that Augustine was considered and is called the father of Western theology or Western thought. So this is really important to deal with, and we're going to spend several videos going over and dealing with it. And I just want to give an introductory to this process. So we're going to deal with some of the theology issues, and then in the process we'll come to understand where we have issues in our soteriology, which is our salvation theology, and also in our return of Christ or the coming of Christ issues as well, and our misunderstanding as a result there. So please don't misunderstand, okay? I'm not here to challenge anyone's faith. You know, I'm not here to suggest that your Christian experience isn't real and valid. It is. This is an issue of how we live and walk in the life that Jesus invited us to. And what we're getting from the institution we call church is not the life that Jesus suggests. It's actually more in line with the death of the carnal mind that Paul warns us about. And like he even warned the Galatians about, why so soon have you gone to another gospel? Traded the gospel that Jesus Christ revealed to Paul for another. So what we have to do is come up with what is this context in which we hang all of our theological ideas on. What is it that we are looking to understand? And I can tell you without a doubt that in this context, God is way bigger and He's way better than we could have ever imagined. We have missed out so much in what God actually introduces to us in Jesus Christ. So let's see what we can do in terms of moving forward. Now, understandably, this is going to require a lot of effort on your part as well, because it's easy for us to take information as it's being given and to file it into a system that we already know. We call that kind of our schema and our beliefs. We take our beliefs and file them away in the scheme of things that we understand, and so we're always trying to work it out. But until we get the true context in which to understand all these things, we're going to continue to miss it and not understand it. And one of the saddest things that people can say to me as a result of going through some of these teachings is that they will suggest, well, my beliefs are really not that different than yours. And right away I know exactly what they did. They took the information I was giving and they put it into the context and the scheme that they already had. And that's not going to be helpful. We have to go back and re-understand what the scriptures are actually suggesting in the context of context that Jesus Christ reveals to us in his life, in the way that he lived here on earth. So let me illustrate this if I can. Let's suppose that an engine, a car engine, is the illustration of what drives our theology. Okay, so by analogy, a car engine or a piston engine that you find in a car is the driving force of our theology. All right, so in that we have lots of parts. Okay, on an engine we have carburetors or fuel injection now more so, water pumps, crankshafts, the like, all kinds of parts. So in our theology we also have lots of parts. We have parts like justification and sanctification, salvation, redemption. Some holy parts, some not so holy parts. So all different kinds of things and parts that we put onto our engine. And so this is what allows our engine to run and function. And this is what we call the way it fleshes out in our Christian life. It's what allows us to move along in our Christian life as we understand how all these parts fit together and our little engine's running away there. And of course, we all have our favorite engines. We have, there's a Ford and a Chevy engine and, Lexus or Cadillac, whatever. In the same way, we have our Baptist engines, our Presbyterian engines, our Assembly of God engines, Catholic engines, whatever. There's over 30,000 different engines in the theological arena to choose from. So in this context, though, imagine this now. As we read the scriptures are similar to what we would call an operation manual. Okay, they tell us how all these parts fit together or how they fit on the engine, the way they're supposed to go and how they function and those kinds of things. But here's the rub. Suppose, if you will, that the scriptures were actually written as a jet engine operation manual. Think about that for a moment. This is the kind of difference that we're talking about here. That we have taken what you could consider a turbine engine, or the kind of engine you find on a jet, and we have been taking the parts, those parts, and trying to fit them onto our piston engine frame. And it just will not work. It doesn't work out. And ultimately, the best we're left with is the idea, well, God's ways are higher than our ways, and God's thoughts are higher than our ways, and that's where we leave it. There's no real desire or a motivation to seek these things any different. We just kind of write it off because, oh well, God will work it all out in the end. And actually the verses that's taken from Isaiah actually suggest something very different. The Isaiah passage is saying, listen, yes, God's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, but God is raining them down upon the earth, on the whole earth, saturating it. And this changes everything. The hills, begin to clap their hands and go forth with singing. And the thistle is turned into a productive plant, big trees growing. So the idea that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways higher than our thoughts is completely blown out of the water. That is not what the scripture is actually suggesting. It's saying God is not satisfied with us not knowing his ways and his thoughts. And he's doing everything he can to saturate our hearts and our minds with his ways and his thoughts. This is not something we have to wait for in terms of the heavenly. It's not that we'll understand everything, but we're talking about key things that are important to our daily life and our walk here. The difference of walking in death or walking in life, in light of the tree of life rather than the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this is where we are. Welcome to America. We're putting turbine engine parts on our piston engines and calling it church. That's where we are. That's what we're left with. So the reality is that, we even have people that are trained in this. Years and years of doing this. They go to school and learn how to mount turbine engine parts to our piston engine. It's what we've grown up in. Okay? It's who we are as a church. And it's not that we're pointing the finger at anyone here. It's the reality in which we live, and we need to deal with it. We need to stop and take time and make an effort to say, look, enough is enough. So, my challenge to you, in the effort that it's going to take you to work through this video and this whole series, is that you have to really assume that you know nothing about turbine engines. Okay? Yeah, I know, nothing about turbine engine theology. We're well versed in piston engine theology and at trying to fit turbine engine parts onto it. So even though some of the parts may sound familiar, I can assure you that their function is very different. So when I talk about a fan in terms of a piston engine, it's just a little thing that goes on the front of the engine typically to try and keep it cool, blowing air through the radiator or across the engine. But a fan in a turbine engine is really one of the key parts that makes it operate. So while the parts may sound familiar in many ways, they operate and function very differently. So it will take some effort on our part to really come to the point and say, look, I'm going to allow this thing to unfold in the way that will allow me to take these parts and put them in the proper frame. We have to start with a turbine frame rather than our piston frame that we adopted many years ago. So,